I released a video several months ago called the Peoples of Eriador, showing maps of the different peoples and races that lived in the lands of Eriador, their movements, their interactions with each other, and their ultimate fates. Today I'll be showing you the same, with another of Middle-earth's large, diverse regions. Welcome, lady and gentlemen, to the Peoples of Rhovanion. The lands that make up the region of Rhovanion are geographically well defined. The western border is that of the Misty Mountains, the northern border is that of the Grey Mountains, and the eastern border seems to be a line from the Iron Hills down to the western shore of the Sea of Rhûn. The southern border is the only border that is never definitively given. Some put it at the River Limelight to the borderlands of Mordor, whereas other people include the lands of Rohan as part of Rhovanion. For the sake of this video, Rohan will mostly be considered part of Gondor, and the western portion of the mysterious lands of Rhûn will be included as part of Rhovanion. Our first map is at the end of the First Age. Although far from the action of most of the First Age, we actually know a decent amount about Rhovanion during its earlier years. From the Silmarillion, we learn that groups of Teleri elves would split off from the main host, and would end up dwelling in the wide woods on either side of the Anduin. These elves were known as Thandor. They would not live without neighbours for long, as the dwarf known as Durin would soon awake in Mount Gundabad, and would found the Longbeard kingdom of Khazad-dûm. His peoples would stretch from Gundabad in the north to Khazad-dûm in the south, and they would establish a far-flung colony in the distant Iron Hills. Although they would lay claim to the Grey Mountains and the Lonely Mountain, we don't have any evidence of them actually living in these mountains at this stage. Late in the First Age, the elves and dwarves would soon be joined by men. From the east travelled the Edain, seeking lands where they would be safe from Morgoth's corruption. Only a minority of these people would ever actually go to Beleriand. Many of them end up settling in the wide lands of Rhovanion, between the Sea of Rhûn and Greenwood, in the valleys beneath the Grey Mountains, and in the Vales of Anduin north of the Gladden Fields. Related to the House of Hador, these men would go on to become the Northmen, and they would soon become stalwart allies of the dwarves. I did a whole video on them if you want to check it out. Further east, beyond the Sea of Rhûn, would presumably live many different tribes and cultures of men, collectively known as the Easterlings. With Morgoth's attention focused on the elves and men in Beleriand, the peoples that lived in Rhovanion would dwell in relative peace and harmony throughout most of the First Age. The year of 750 of the Second Age would bring the first major changes to this region. Many of the Sindar of former Beleriand, led by Amdir and Orifer, would settle in the region. Orifer would become king of the Greenwood Elves, and Amdir would become king of the Galadrim. Although both regions are still peopled by mostly Nandor, now known as the Sylvan Elves, they would soon diverge both culturally and linguistically thanks to outside influence. There's also the Entwives who dwell in the land south of Greenwood. We're not exactly sure when they moved there, but for the sake of this video I'm assuming early Second Age. They build bountiful gardens in these lands and teach the nearby Mannish peoples secrets of agriculture that had so far eluded them. Another thing I want to draw attention to is Dorwinion. It's the land with the question mark. Now, Dorwinion has been the source of much debate over the years. Was it a Mannish realm, or was it an Elven realm, or did it have a mix of both? There's evidence that supports both sides, but it seems like we'll never get a proper answer. I'm going to do a video on it eventually, probably featuring in my new Middle-earth Mysteries playlist, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to give it this special question mark. Unfortunately, Rhovanion's peace comes crashing down during the War of the Elves and Sauron, which ends in 1701 of the Second Age. Although it was a side theatre that we don't know much about, the devastation that fell upon Rhovanion was no different to that which fell on Eriador. The Longbeards, long in alliance with the Northmen, shut their doors and hide in their mountain homes. Sauron's orcs take Gundabad from the Longbeards, much to their aggrievement, and they end up infesting the Grey Mountains, cutting off all communication with the Iron Hills. The Northmen fare worse. They are attacked by orcs as well as tribes of Easterlings from the east, and by the time the war is over, they are reduced to a small, impoverished people living in the eaves of Greenwood or in the caves of the mountains. The Galadrim and Greenwood elves fare a lot better, seemingly able to keep their borders secure. One thing you may notice is that the Greenwood elves have withdrawn from southern Greenwood, abandoning their capital at Amon Lank. This isn't actually due to Sauron, but rather due to Orifer's distrust of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and of the Noldoran influence in Lothlorien. He withdraws these people northwards on 3 separate occasions, eventually stopping at the mountains of Mirkwood. The lands of Rhovanion would stay much the same for the rest of the Second Age. The Northmen would slowly regain their strength, and the elves and dwarves would remain wary of Sauron and his servants. We can now skip to the end of the Second Age, right after the War of the Last Alliance. A major casualty of this war is the Entwives, whose lands are burned by Sauron when he learns of the advancing Last Alliance. The Entwives are presumably wiped out. Although the Free Peoples take heavy casualties in the war, they are ultimately victorious. Sauron is defeated, his orcs are diminished, and his mannish servants mostly withdraw from the Western lands. With the passing of the Second Age, Rhovanion is largely emptied of people, but with no immediate threats, the peoples that do live in these lands can begin to multiply and spread once again. We can now skip to the year 1000 of the Third Age. This is a good base point to show off the changes that have occurred in Rhovanion during the early Third Age. The Elven and Dwarven realms are much the same, but 1,000 years of peace have radically altered the mannish cultures that now dwell in the region. The Northmen, who were once a rather monolithic people, have now divided into several different subgroups. The largest and most powerful of these groups are the Men of Rhovanion, who dwell between Greenwood and the Sea of Rhûn. They are a warlike people who have mastered the taming and riding of horses. To the north of them, above the River Celduin, live the ancestors of the Dale Men and the Lake Men of Esgaroth, who I'll refer to as the Proto-Dale Men, as Dale has not been founded yet and Esgaroth's status is unknown. In the woods of central Greenwood live a sparse yet tough people known as the Woodmen, because they, live in the woods. They seem to live in small communities and have no centralized leadership. On the other side of Greenwood, between the Gladden Fields in the south and the Carrock in the north, live the Men of the Vales of Anduin, also known as the Vale Men. It's possible that the Beornings also live amongst them. There's also another group of men which first enter our history books around this time, the Perianath, the Hobbits. Around this time, they are recorded as living in the Vales of Anduin, probably around the Gladden Fields. They've probably lived there for several centuries at this point, but when they arrived, or where they arrived from, is completely unknown. They are an isolationist people, and although they get along well enough with the Northmen, they are wary of other groups of men. In the south of Rhovanion, Easterling tribes have once again started to encroach westward, following their defeat at the hands of Gondor several centuries earlier. They often fight the Northmen, but occasionally they ally with them in their raids on Gondorian territory. This results in Gondor's attention turning northwards, and thus we come to the year of 1300 of the Third Age. 50 years earlier, Gondorian armies led by Prince Minalcar smash the Easterlings and drive them beyond the Sea of Rhûn once again. The Gondorians give favour to a Northman prince named Vidugavia, who in turn becomes King of Rhovanion. His realm lies between the Sea of Rhûn and Mirkwood. I now say Mirkwood because the forest has been renamed. Thanks to the presence of the Necromancer in the old elven capital of Amon Lank, which is now Dol Guldur, much of Mirkwood has now been peopled by his evil creatures, which includes giant spiders and orcs. The Woodmen are able to survive, but the Elves of Mirkwood, led by Thranduil, withdraw further northwards, beyond the Forest River. Unfortunately, the Necromancer isn't the only evil to arrive in Rhovanion. During the same year, Angmar is founded on the other side of the Misty Mountains, but a portion of its people, the Men of Angmar, end up on the eastern side of the mountains. Their effect and impact on the greater region is unknown, but their presence seems to inhibit Northman groups from spreading into the northern Vales of Anduin, where they had once lived many years ago. Orcs are also said to have begun spreading in the Misty Mountains once again, forcing Durin's folk further into isolation in their mountain kingdom of Khazad-dûm. The darkening of the region has another impact. By this time, the hobbits who once dwelt near the Gladden Fields have all fled across the Misty Mountains into Eriador. This begins with the Harfoot hobbits in 1050, and the Fallowhides and Stores follow them about a century later. The reason for this is the arrival of hostile Easterlings from Rhûn, who, although are soon defeated by Gondor, cause enough trouble to force the hobbits from their lands. Our next major year of change is 1856 of the Third Age. The two aforementioned evils of the Necromancer and the Men of Angmar have largely been quiet, but the Easterlings have not. A new confederation of Easterling peoples known as the Wainriders begins to attack the Northmen, who have been devastated by the Great Plague, and decisively defeats both them and the Gondorians at the Battle of the Plains. Gondor withdraws beyond the Anduin, and most of the Men of Rhovanion are enslaved. However, some of them manage to escape. Some flee to Gondor, some flee northwards across the Celduin, where the Proto-Daemonmen seemingly remain free, but a larger group flee to the other side of Mirkwood, taking up residence in the lands north of the Gladden Fields. They would be known as the Aetheod. Gondor's wars with the Wainriders continue for another 100 years, which eventually results in the defeat of the Wainriders following the Battle of the Camp in 1944. Although the Wainriders are defeated, Easterlings continue to remain in the lands east of the Anduin, and the Northmen would not return to the old lands that they once called home. On the other side of Mirkwood, things have gotten better for the Northmen. The Aetheod, they who aid in the defeat of both the Wainriders and the Kingdom of Angmar, and in 1978 they drive Angmar's remaining people out of the upper Vales of Anduin and claim that land for themselves. the men of Angmar are not the only people to be dislodged. In the year of 1981, Durin's folk are forced to flee Khazad-dûm after awakening a Balrog the year before. They become a wandering people, and with the end of dwarven presence in the Misty Mountains, the dangers within that mountain range begin to grow stronger by the year. This has an effect on the Galadrim of Lothlorien too, and many of the Sylvan Elves actually flee south, sailing into the west from the port of Edelond. In the end, this dwarven exile only lasts for a little under 20 years. In 1999, Thrain I leads the majority of these people to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and founds a new kingdom for Durin's folk. They enter into a close alliance with the neighbouring Manish peoples, those who would become the Dale Men and the Lake Men of Esgaroth. However, dwarven occupation of the Lonely Mountain lasts only 2 centuries before many of Durin's folk begin to migrate into the large and mostly unexplored Grey Mountains, presumably driving out or exterminated the orcs that dwelt in that mountain range. By 2210, the migration is completed with the removal of King Thorin I to the Grey Mountains. Most of this takes place during the Watchful Peace, a 4-century-long period of relative peace for the west of Middle-earth. This happens after Gandalf attempts to learn the identity of the Necromancer, only for the Necromancer to flee. This comes to an end late in the 25th century, when attacks renew upon the Free Peoples. Perhaps the most threatening of these attacks comes from the Balkoth, a tribe of Easterlings who have gathered between Mirkwood and the River Kelduin. They are descended from the Wain Riders, who were never truly pushed out of Rhovanion, and under the service of Sauron, they have begun attacking into Gondorian and Northman territory, pushing up into the Vales of Anduin. They aren't the only major threat though. With the evacuation of the dwarves several centuries earlier, orcs have now started to take control of the major passes in the Misty Mountains. Notably, they have also taken over the abandoned city of Moria, sharing it with the Balrog. This is threatening to the various peoples who live in the Vales of Anduin, and none would have more reason to be afraid than the Stores, a group of hobbits. These are the people Smeagol belonged to, and although the hobbits did leave Rhovanion over 1,000 years earlier, these group of Stores have returned, making their home in the Gladden Fields, probably sometime during the Watchful Peace. The reignition of war between the Free Peoples and Sauron's forces culminates in the Battle of the Field of Celebrant in 2510. The Balkoth are mostly destroyed and are reabsorbed into the other Easterling tribes, who remain a persistent threat in the lands beyond the Anduin. An army of orcs is also destroyed in the battle, which begins the decline of their power in the Misty Mountains. Unable to populate the province of Calanadon effectively, Gondor gifts that land to the Aethiod, who abandon their homes in the upper Vales of Anduin and travel to their new lands named Rohan. They would soon become known as the Rohirrim. Yet even as the Free Peoples seem to be gaining the upper hand in Rhovanion, the dwarves suffer the first of several major setbacks. In 2590, they concede defeat during the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, mostly abandoning the Grey Mountains and returning to either the Lonely Mountain or the Iron Hills. The Grey Mountains are then reinfested by orcs and dragons. The refounding of the kingdom under the mountain also re-establishes the strong connection between Durin's folk and the nearby Northmen. Around this time, the town of Dale is founded, and Dale becomes an exceedingly wealthy city-state in partnership with the dwarves. Of course, this wasn't to last forever. In 2770, the dragon, Smaug, descends upon the Lonely Mountain, seeking to establish dominion over the wealth that the dwarves had now gathered. He takes the Lonely Mountain, and shortly afterwards, the nearby town of Dale is deserted. The land in direct vicinity of the mountain is laid to waste, becoming known as the Desolation of Smaug. Durin's folk flee either to Dunland in the west or to their kinsmen in the Iron Hills. The men of Dale are also dispersed into their lands between the Carnan and the Kelduin, and the closest Manish settlement of Esgaroth on the Long Lake becomes the centre of trade and commerce in the area. It's also likely that the Store hobbits who lived in the Gladden Fields are gone by around this time, their ultimate fate being unknown. The loss of Erebor would result in much of Durin's folk wandering in exile for nearly 200 years, during which time the War of the Dwarves and Orcs occurs, which nearly annihilates the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. The Dwarves would eventually get revenge in 2941, when Smaug was killed by Bard the Bowman during an attack on Esgaroth. Bard becomes the first king of Dale, and his kingdom unites the Northman people between the Carnan and the Kelduin, now known as the Bardings. Likewise, the king under the mountain is re-established by King Dain Ironfoot, and a united front is once again posed against Sauron in the northern lands. The destruction visited upon the Orcs of the Misty Mountains during the Battle of the Five Armies allows the Valemen and their Beorning chieftains several decades of peace and prosperity. The picture is much the same leading into the War of the Ring, 3019 of the Third Age. The only major change to happen during this time was Balin's brief colony in Moria, which existed between the years of 2989 and 2994. Otherwise, the Bardings and Durin's folk have recovered much of their strength. The Elves of Mirkwood, despite their shrinking territory, have grown in strength since the beginning of the Third Age. The Valemen are at their strongest in many years, and the Beornings hold the passes in the Misty Mountains. Despite the shadow under the trees, the Woodmen also persist, fighting for every inch of ground against the shadow of Dol Guldur. The picture is not wholly good though. The orcs who dwell in the Misty and Grey Mountains are still very weak at this point and pose little more than a local threat, but Sauron and his direct allies are at the strongest they've been since the Second Age. The shadow of Dol Guldur has grown strong despite the fortress being abandoned on 2 different occasions in the past. Likewise, Easterlings continue to pour westward from beyond the Sea of Rhûn. Swordsmen, axemen with long beards, roaming cavalry, and powerful charioteers. It's no exaggeration to say that the history of Rhovanion and its people has been very up and down. The land has seen centuries of long peace and prosperity where the peoples have been protected by powerful armies led by noble kings. But at the same time, the land has seen centuries of death and destruction, where entire nations have been toppled, peoples wiped out or enslaved, and the survivors living in miserable poverty. No land in Middle-earth has suffered so many invasions, and managed to bounce back almost every single time. By the end of the Third Age, the people who live in Rhovanion may not belong to the most powerful nations on Middle-earth, nor are they the wealthiest or most advanced for the most part, but they're tough, and moving into the Fourth Age, they have finally managed to overcome all of the challenges that have been thrown at them. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I thank you for all your continued support, both old subscribers and new, and I appreciate all of the comments you post, all the feedback you leave, and trust me, I read them all, even if I'm not replying to them. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're going to live anywhere in Rhovanion, maybe pick Lothlorien.